I will never forget the first time I stepped into that place, the abandoned slum on the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro that no one dares to talk about after nightfall. The moment I crossed the broken fence and climbed into its narrow, overgrown alleyways, I felt a heavy silence pressing down on me, the kind of silence that doesn't come from emptiness, but from something holding its breath, waiting, watching. The air smelled of rust and damp soil, and every step I took echoed louder than it should have, bouncing off cracked concrete walls covered in faded graffiti from decades ago. I held my flashlight tight, but before I could even switch it on, something else lit up the darkness. Far ahead, deep inside the maze of collapsed shacks and hollowed-out homes, a sudden glow appeared, faint at first, then sharp and white, moving as if carried by unseen hands. I froze, unable to understand how there could be light in a place where no electricity had run for years, where every local had sworn to me that no one lived anymore. The glow flickered, disappeared behind a wall, then reappeared in another window, almost teasing me, almost daring me to follow. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as a thought forced itself into my mind. If this slum has been deserted since the 1990s, who or what is walking through it with lights? The further I walked toward that forgotten hill on the edge of Rio de Janeiro, the more I realized that this place was not just abandoned, it had been erased, sealed away from memory, as if the city itself had tried to bury it. People in the nearby neighborhoods didn't even call it by name anymore. They just referred to it in whispers. Aquela favela, that favela, the one nobody climbs after dark, the one where headlights from cars flicker nervously when they pass the main road below. Decades ago, according to the fragments of stories I managed to gather from old residents and taxi drivers who used to drive near here, this community had been alive, filled with children running barefoot through the alleys, with samba echoing from improvised bars, with the smell of feijão drifting from tiny kitchens pressed against each other. And despite the poverty, there was life, there was resilience, there was energy. But something happened in the mid-1990s, something no one explains clearly, a mix of tragedy and rumor. Some said a fire swept through part of the slum. Others whispered about a violent night that left families fleeing in terror. Others insisted it was a curse, that the land itself had been claimed by something older than any of the people who had built homes on it. What everyone agreed on was that the exodus was sudden, unnatural, as if overnight dozens of families left with only the clothes on their backs, leaving furniture, clothes, and even meals half-served on tables, as if they never planned to come back. I had heard these stories while sitting in small bars downtown, where old men drink beer and talk about the past, their voices dropping when the subject came up. One of them told me that he had driven through the area once, years after it was abandoned, and swore he saw lights dancing in the alleys, moving too quickly and too silently to be lanterns or flashlights. Another man, a former soldier, told me that he and his friends tried to explore it one night as a dare, but the moment they reached the main staircase that climbs into the favela, they heard dozens of footsteps around them, echoing above and behind, though every window was empty, every house dark. Terrified, they ran back down without looking over their shoulders, and not one of them ever returned. Even Uber drivers today avoid the detour. They take longer routes around it just to make sure their cars don't climb that hill. And when I asked one directly about the place, his only answer was, "Se você quer voltar vivo, no." So, Blagenoich, if you want to come back alive, don't go up there at night. But curiosity is a cruel weight, and the more people warned me, the more I wanted to see for myself. I read fragments of old newspapers in public archives that mentioned an unresolved incident in the neighborhood in 1992, an event so vague it seemed deliberately covered up, with articles suddenly stopping as if the subject had been banned from print. There were reports of families relocated to other areas of Rio, of government interventions that left no explanation, and then silence, as if the place had been deliberately erased from maps. Even Google Earth images seemed blurred in parts of the hill, a patch of the city that technology itself had decided not to look at too closely. Yet the legends persisted. Neighbors still reported lights, pale and cold, sliding between windows of houses that had collapsed long ago, weaving through the alleys where no electricity had flowed for 30 years. Some said the lights looked like lanterns. Others said they pulsed like fireflies too large to be real. But everyone agreed on one thing. The lights moved with purpose, as if they belonged to someone or something still living inside. When I stood at the foot of the hill that night, I could feel the weight of all those stories pressing on me. The entrance path was cracked, filled with weeds breaking through old concrete, and graffiti sprayed on the walls looked ancient, like ghosts of words once meant to mark territory, but now left to fade under the rain. Silence swallowed the place whole. Not even the sound of dogs barking from nearby houses reached my ears. It felt as if I had stepped across an invisible border, leaving behind the living city and entering a frozen echo of its past. The favela wasn't just abandoned, it was suspended, locked in a perpetual state of waiting, and the thought that I was about to walk into it, into its heart, into the place where the light still moved at night, made my chest tighten with both dread and fascination. And as I raised my flashlight and took that first step upward into the darkness, I realized that no warning, no old tale, no fearful glance from the locals had prepared me for what I was about to uncover. The deeper I climbed into the heart of that forgotten favela, the more the air itself seemed to change, growing heavier, colder, as if I had left Rio de Janeiro far behind and stepped into a world where time no longer flowed in the same way. The first houses I passed were shells of what they had once been, wooden doors hanging loose on rusted hinges, windows shattered and overrun with vines that twisted inside living rooms and bedrooms like green serpents reclaiming what humanity had abandoned. And yet, in the middle of all that decay, there were details that should not have been there. A plastic chair that looked newer than the others, its color less faded by the sun. A broken refrigerator that still had cans inside, as if someone had opened it not so long ago. Graffiti that looked fresh compared to the layers of older paint peeling around it. I paused to touch one of the tags, still bright red against the cracked gray wall, and felt something sticky on my fingertips, almost as if the paint had not fully dried, though no one should have dared to climb here and leave such a mark. The silence was complete, but it wasn't empty. It felt filled with something I couldn't name, like a presence pressing against my skin, brushing the back of my neck, making every hair stand on end. Somewhere above, I thought I heard the faint clink of metal against stone, but when I raised my flashlight in that direction, only the jagged remains of stairs stared back at me, each step cracked and crumbling, leading further upward into the darkness. I moved carefully, my boots crunching against broken glass and fragments of tile, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the alleys, bouncing back as if invisible walls were closer than they appeared. Every corner I turned seemed narrower than the last, the houses leaning into each other as if conspiring to trap me within their crooked embrace. In one open doorway, I caught the faint smell of smoke, sharp and lingering, not the stale kind that settles for years, but the fresh trace of something recently burned. And when I pushed inside, brushing vines away from my path, I found the remnants of a candle stub melted into the floor, wax still soft to the touch. I froze, staring at it, my mind screaming for an explanation. Kids sneaking up here for dares, squatters living secretly. But the silence outside told me otherwise, because if someone was living here, I should have heard them by now, breathing, shuffling, whispering. Instead, the house exhaled nothing but darkness. When I stepped back into the alley, a sudden flicker caught my eye far at the end of the passage. It wasn't my flashlight, and it wasn't the weak starlight bleeding through the clouds. It was a light, pale and blue, moving slowly across the facade of another house, pausing, then sliding upward as if climbing an invisible staircase. I blinked, convinced my mind was playing tricks. but the light shimmered again, stronger, casting faint shadows across the weeds that had sprouted between them. Cobblestones. I tried to convince myself it was a reflection, maybe from a distant car or a plane overhead, but there were no cars on this dead hill, no planes crossing the sky at that hour, and the glow was too deliberate, too precise, as if it knew I was watching. My chest tightened with unease, and I took a slow step forward, then another, every part of me screaming not to follow, yet unable to resist the pull of curiosity that had brought me here in the first place. As I drew closer, the sound returned. The metallic clink, faint but steady this time, almost like chains dragged lightly across stone. I stopped and listened, my heart pounding in rhythm with the noise, but the moment I held my breath to hear it clearer, it vanished, swallowed by the silence as if mocking me. I turned in a slow circle, shining my flashlight across the abandoned facades, illuminating the hollow eyes of windows that gaped back at me, their glass long shattered, their frames warped. But in that moment, I could have sworn I saw movement, a curtain twitching behind one of the openings, though every curtain here should have rotted away decades ago. I raised the beam higher, but the window was empty, its interior nothing but shadow and dust. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. The air seemed to vibrate softly, carrying with it the faintest echo of footsteps that weren't mine, padding lightly on the stones behind me, then stopping when I turned, leaving me staring into an alley empty, but for the twisting vines and collapsing walls. My hand trembled as I raised the flashlight, and in its circle of light, I noticed another oddity, a shoe print pressed into the dirt, deep and recent, its edges sharp and undisturbed by rain or wind, far too fresh for a place that supposedly hadn't seen life in 30 years. I crouched to touch it, my fingers tracing its outline, and felt a chill run through me as I realized it pointed not down the alley, but directly toward me, as if someone or something had been standing exactly where I was now. Before I could process the thought, the flicker of blue light returned, this time much closer, glowing inside a house to my left, its broken window frames breathing out that cold illumination in pulses, like a heartbeat. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, and forced myself to step toward it, one foot dragging after the other, because I knew that if I turned back now, I would never find the courage to climb further. And as I reached the threshold, I heard it clearly, whispers, faint and indistinguishable, curling around me like smoke, voices too low to belong to any living throat, yet too deliberate to be the wind. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I tightened my grip on the flashlight, realizing with terrifying certainty that this place was not just a ruin swallowed by time. It was awake, it was aware, and it was watching me. I stepped across the cracked threshold of that ruined house with the strange blue glow, my breath shallow, my body tense, as if every muscle already knew I had crossed an invisible line. The doorway leaned sideways, eaten by termites and weather, but inside, the air felt unnaturally dense, colder than the night outside, carrying a faint metallic taste that clung to my tongue. Dust floated lazily in the beam of my flashlight, but beneath its weak cone of light, the blue radiance pulsed on its own, seeping through the cracks of the broken walls, almost as if it were alive. I took another step, the floor groaning under my weight, and then I froze, because in the far corner, for just an instant, I saw it, a figure standing still, almost blending with the wall, outlined only by the strange illumination. It didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't react, but the shape was unmistakably human, tall and narrow, its head tilted slightly as if studying me. I gasped and blinked, and in that fraction of a second, the corner was empty again, only peeling plaster and vines curling down from the ceiling, but my pulse was already racing, my mind spinning with the certainty that I had not imagined it. The silence pressed in on me, broken only by the sound of dripping water somewhere deeper inside, steady drops, echoing like a slow clock counting down, and with each tick, I felt the weight of unseen eyes following me. I backed toward the door, But before I could step out, the blue glow died abruptly, plunging the room into complete darkness, except for my trembling flashlight. The sudden shift made my chest clench as if the house itself had taken a sharp breath. Then, as if in answer to my fear, a light flickered on in the house across the alley, not from any bulb or lantern, but that same eerie bluish fire sliding behind a shattered window, pulsing once, twice, then vanishing again. My instincts screamed at me to run, but curiosity shackled my feet in place, dragging my gaze upward as another window lit up higher along the slope. Then another, until 3 separate houses glowed faintly in unison, as if the entire slum was slowly waking up around me. I stepped outside, the alley now darker than before. Every shadow stretched unnaturally long, and that's when I caught it again. Movement, not of light this time, but of something inside one of the glowing windows. A silhouette crossing slowly, deliberately, pausing in the center as though aware I was watching. I raised my flashlight toward it, but the beam only illuminated shattered glass and crumbling bricks, the figure gone as if it had dissolved into the walls themselves. I whispered to myself that it was impossible, that I was only tired, that my brain was conjuring phantoms from the stories I had absorbed. But deep down, I knew the difference between imagination and the raw instinct of danger, and what I felt in that moment was the latter. The air itself seemed to vibrate, and with every pulse of light from those houses, I swore I could hear faint voices layered over each other, whispers too low to understand, yet carrying a rhythm like a chant, like dozens of mouths murmuring just beyond hearing. I forced myself to step closer to the glowing house across the alley, my boots crunching against gravel and glass, and as I leaned toward the doorway, the glow extinguished again, smothered, as though the moment I tried to pierce it, it fled deeper into the darkness. Then came the sound that turned my blood to ice. A knock, slow and deliberate, echoing against wood. 3 hollow raps that came from the very doorframe I was standing under. I stumbled back, my flashlight beam shaking wildly across the alley walls, catching only broken doors and gaping windows. But the knocking came again, this time from a different house, then another, spreading like a signal across the slum, a dozen unseen hands announcing themselves in perfect chilling rhythm. My throat went dry, my body rooted to the spot as the knocking faded and silence reclaimed the hill, only for the lights to flare again, brighter this time, not blue but white, harsh and cold, spilling across the alleys like floodlights with no source. My eyes watered under their intensity, and that's when I saw it, through the glare, through the fog of dust and vines. Figures were there, more than one, scattered across windows and thresholds, unmoving, watching, outlines of people where no people should exist. My heart thundered as I squinted, trying to focus, and one of the figures shifted its head ever so slightly, enough for me to feel the certainty that it wasn't an illusion. They were aware of me, and they wanted me to know. My breath caught in my throat, and the thought slammed into my mind with terrifying clarity. I was no longer investigating abandoned ruins. I had been noticed, acknowledged, and whatever lived in this forgotten place had chosen to reveal itself to me. The moment those silhouettes dissolved back into the shadows, I should have turned around and left that cursed hill behind. But instead, I found myself climbing deeper, as if some invisible thread tied to my chest was pulling me upward through the labyrinth of alleys toward the source of those impossible lights. The farther I went, the stranger the slum became, as though the ruins themselves were rearranging to confuse me. Alleys I thought I had just crossed now looked narrower, steeper, and the houses leaned so close together that the sky was reduced to a thin crack of blackness above me. Every step echoed too loudly, bouncing back in a way that suggested the sound wasn't traveling freely, but being absorbed and returned by something unseen. And every time I stopped to listen, I could hear faint breathing behind the walls, slow and deliberate, like lungs inhaling through rotten wood and exhaling into the night. My flashlight caught odd details I couldn't ignore. Children's toys scattered in the dirt, too clean to have been abandoned for 30 years. The imprint of hands smeared across a wall in black soot, some small like a child's, others large, pressed with such force the fingers had left deep streaks. An old television sitting in the corner of a roofless home, its cracked screen flashing faint static, even though there were no wires, no power, no life to sustain it. The sight made my stomach turn, but before I could move, a sharp sound broke the silence. A door creaked open ahead of me, not in the soft sway of the wind, but with deliberate weight, the hinges screaming as if something unseen had just slipped inside. I stepped closer, my boots crunching on broken tiles, and saw the door swinging slowly, revealing a room swallowed in darkness. I shone my flashlight inside and froze, because lined along the cracked walls were dozens of melted candles, their wax dripping in rivers down into the dirt floor. And though most were extinguished, a few still smoldered faintly, releasing trails of smoke that curled toward the ceiling. The smell was sharp, unmistakably recent, and my heart thudded in my chest as I realized someone, or something, had lit them not long before I arrived. Suddenly the air shifted, carrying with it the sound of a low hum, vibrating faintly like a voice chanting from somewhere deeper in the structure. I backed away, but when I turned I saw movement in the alley. Lights again, not one or two this time, but dozens, weaving like will-o'-the-wisps through the windows of the surrounding homes, illuminating the slum in a ghostly ballet, circling me as if to trap me in their orbit. My breath quickened, and I stumbled backward up a flight of broken stairs, trying to gain some vantage point, but as I climbed, the humming grew louder, layered, multiplied, until it sounded like an entire crowd, whispering at once, their voices overlapping, too low to decipher, yet unmistakably aware of my presence. At the top of the stairs, I reached a landing where the houses opened into a small courtyard, and that was when the full horror unfolded. Every house around the square was glowing faintly, their windows lit with that unnatural light. And in each one, I could see faint shadows moving behind the curtains, their shapes indistinct yet undeniably human. They didn't step outside, they didn't reveal themselves fully, but they shifted, leaned, paused, always angled toward me, always staring, and I felt my knees weaken under the weight of so many unseen eyes. The hum reached a crescendo, a low droning that seemed to crawl into my skull, and suddenly it stopped, cut off mid-breath, plunging the courtyard into suffocating silence. Then, from the center of the space, a sound broke through, footsteps soft but steady, approaching across the cracked stones, though no figure was visible in my flashlight's trembling beam. I backed against the wall, my pulse hammering in my throat, and the footsteps stopped just a few feet away, leaving only darkness before me. And then a whisper, clear this time, curling into my ear, though no lips were near enough to form it. Você não devia estar aqui. You should not be here. I spun in panic, sweeping the flashlight wildly, but the alley was empty, only vines swaying gently as if disturbed by a presence I could not see. Then, as if mocking me, all the lights in the surrounding houses flared at once, so bright I had to shield my eyes, and in that blinding instant I saw them. Figures pressed against the windows, dozens of them, their faces blurred, their eyes burning like hollow lanterns. They didn't move, they didn't blink, but I could feel their attention crushing, me pulling me down into the earth itself, and I knew with absolute certainty that I had crossed a threshold I was never meant to cross. My chest heaved, my legs screamed to run, but the slum had closed around me like a trap, and the only way forward was deeper, into the very heart of its impossible glow. I don't remember deciding to move, but somehow my feet carried me out of that courtyard and into another passageway that wound higher up the hill, as if the slum itself was guiding me deeper into its rotting heart, and every step I took seemed to pull me further from the living world and closer to some place that had been waiting for me all along. The air grew heavier, thicker, with a strange, almost sweet odor that clung to the back of my throat like decayed fruit. And for a moment, I thought I heard the faint echo of children laughing far away, though the sound was warped, stretched and broken, like a recording played backward. I reached a small open space where the remains of an old market stood. Wooden stalls half collapsed under vines, rusted metal frames jutting into the air like broken bones. But what stopped me cold were the traces of life that should not have been there. Fresh footprints stamped into the dirt, overlapping, dozens of them, some small, some large, all pointing in different directions, circling each other like a crowd had been gathering there just minutes before I arrived. My flashlight traced the impressions slowly, my breath catching when I realized some of them overlapped mine, as if something had been walking behind me, following in my exact steps since I first entered. I crouched down, pressing my hand against one of the deeper prints, and the dirt was still damp, not with rain, but with something darker, almost oily, leaving a stain on my palm that shimmered faintly under the beam of my light. I wiped it off against my pants, heart pounding, when suddenly the laughter returned, closer this time, echoing from the alley to my left. I turned, shining the flashlight, and caught sight of something that froze me in place. A tattered shirt, hanging from a line stretched between two ruined windows, swaying slightly, as if caught in a breeze, but the air was perfectly still. Beneath it, scattered on the ground, were children's notebooks, their pages yellowed and eaten by mold, but one lay open, and across it scrawled in charcoal were words written in jagged, frantic handwriting. "No entre, do not enter." The sight made my stomach twist, but before I could react, a low murmur rose all around me, dozens of voices at once, whispering in Portuguese words I couldn't fully catch, fragments like prayers or warnings, circling me in waves that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I spun slowly, my light catching glimpses of movement, a curtain sliding shut, a shadow crossing a window, the faint reflection of eyes glowing in the darkness, but never fast enough to catch them directly. Then, as if the whispers had been building toward it, a sudden burst of light flared from the largest building at the edge of the square, a two-story structure that looked like it had once been a community center or school, its facade cracked, but its outline still standing proud above the rest of the ruins. Every one of its windows glowed at once with that same unnatural blue-white radiance, and within them, figures shifted, indistinct at first, then clearer, the outlines of people moving, slowly pacing, turning, stopping to stare directly at me from behind the broken glass. I staggered backward, my body colliding with the remains of a stall, sending wood splintering across the ground, but my eyes were locked on those windows. There must have been 20, 30 figures inside, each one standing perfectly still except for the faint tilt of their heads, their eyes fixed on me with a focus that burned even through the distance, and for the first time, I realized these weren't just echoes or tricks of light. They were intelligent, aware, waiting for me to acknowledge them. My breath shook as I raised the flashlight toward the building, but the beam was swallowed by the glow, as if the light itself refused to reveal more. And then the figures moved in unison, every head turning slightly to the right, as if responding to something I couldn't see. I followed their gaze, my heart racing, and that's when I noticed the staircase leading into the building, its steps crumbling but still intact. And on the top step, something waited, a small object glinting faintly in the glow. I forced my trembling legs to move closer, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, and when I reached the bottom of the stairs, I leaned down to pick it up. It was a key, old and rusted, heavy in my palm, its teeth jagged and strange, and tied to it by a strip of rotting cloth was another message scrawled in the same frantic handwriting: "No olhe para trás." Do not look back. The moment I read the words, a chill ran down my spine, and though my entire body begged me to disobey, to turn and check the darkness behind me, I clenched my jaw and forced myself to keep staring ahead, clutching the key in my fist. The whispers rose again, sharper this time, their tones no longer warnings, but something closer to anger, echoing all around me. And with each pulse of sound, I felt the ground beneath my feet tremble faintly, as if the very earth rejected my presence. The glow in the windows flickered, dimmed, then surged brighter than ever. And in that brilliance, I finally saw them clearly. The figures were not shadows, but people, or what remained of them. Their faces pale and distorted, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes hollow pits glowing with cold fire. They pressed their hands against the glass, leaving no prints, only darkness spreading like cracks across the surface. And as they leaned closer, the windows began to rattle, the whole building shuddering as though about to burst. My grip tightened on the key, and in that instant I understood with terrifying clarity. This slum wasn't abandoned, it wasn't empty. It was inhabited by something that wanted me here, something that had been waiting. And the key in my hand was not a warning, but an invitation. Clutching that rusted key in my palm, I felt as though I had crossed a threshold no one else had dared to. A silent pact sealed between me and the slum itself, and with every breath I drew, I knew that turning back was no longer an option, that whatever lived here had marked me, had chosen me, and was now guiding me toward the heart of its secret. The stairway leading into the old two-story building yawned ahead, like the open mouth of some colossal beast, and though my body screamed with dread, my legs moved of their own accord, climbing step by step, the boards groaning under my weight, as if warning me with every creak that I was trespassing into forbidden ground. The glow from the windows above flared brighter with each step, and shadows pressed against the glass, like restless souls desperate to break free, their blurred faces twisting in silent agony. And yet none of them moved from their prison, as though the moment I touched that key, I had become the only moving piece in their terrible game. At the top of the staircase, I reached the doorway. The frame blackened with soot and slid the key into the lock. It resisted at first, grinding like old bones, but then turned smoothly, unnaturally, as if the mechanism had been waiting all along for my hand. And with a heavy click, the door swung inward on its own, breathing out a gust of cold air that smelled of ash, mold, and something faintly metallic, like dried blood. Inside the building, the darkness was total despite the glow outside, and when I raised my flashlight, its beam seemed weaker than ever, swallowed by shadows that clung to the walls like living things. I stepped across the threshold, my pulse hammering, and found myself in what looked like a wide classroom, rows of rusted desks still bolted to the cracked floor, chalk dust staining the walls with ghostly scribbles that no hand had touched in decades. Yet scattered across the desks were objects that made my blood run cold. Half-burnt candles still warm to the touch, children's drawings pinned beneath shards of glass, and in the center of the room, a single chair turned toward me, its seat empty. But beneath it lay a pile of notebooks, each one open to the same page, each page scrawled with the same words over and over in jagged handwriting. Não olhe para trás, não olhe para trás. My throat tightened, and for the first time I realized that the warnings were not meant to keep me away, but to control the way I moved, to keep me looking forward, never daring to see what followed behind. The silence was unbearable, pressing against my eardrums until I almost screamed just to break it, when suddenly the chair creaked, shifting slightly as if someone had just stood up from it, though the seat was empty. My light swept across the room, and that's when I saw them. The figures that had been shadows in the windows were here now, gathered at the edges of the classroom, their outlines faint but undeniable, faces blurred and distorted, eyes glowing like dying embers, their bodies swaying gently as if moved by a wind I could not feel. They did not speak. They did not step closer, but their presence was suffocating, a pressure in the air that made my chest seize and my vision swim. I stumbled backward, clutching the key like a talisman, and as I did, the whispers began again, louder than ever, filling the room in a chorus of broken voices, some crying, some laughing, some chanting words I could not understand, the sound weaving together into a wall of madness that threatened to crush my mind. My flashlight flickered violently, and in those strobing flashes I saw their faces more clearly, the skin pale and translucent, lips cracked and frozen in grotesque expressions, some of anguish, others of cruel delight, and their eyes, hollow pits of fire, locked on me with unrelenting hunger. I pressed myself against the doorframe, desperate to flee, but when I turned the knob, it would not budge, the wood trembling as though held shut by unseen hands. Then through the cacophony, one voice cut through the rest, clear and commanding, a woman's voice speaking directly into my ear, though no figure was near enough to claim it. "You opened the door. Now you must see." My blood froze, and before I could react, the desks began to scrape across the floor, dragged by invisible force into a circle around me, trapping me in the center as the shadows closed in, their whispers rising into a scream that pierced my skull. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head, and when I dared to look up again, the figures were gone. But in their place, the blackboard at the front of the room glowed faintly, words appearing in chalk strokes that wrote themselves before my eyes. "We never left." My stomach lurched and the room tilted, the shadows on the walls lengthening until they seemed to stretch into hands reaching toward me. I stumbled forward, breaking free of the circle of desks, and the moment I crossed its boundary, the whispers cut off, replaced by a silence so sudden it rang in my ears. My heart slammed against my ribs as I backed toward the door again, and this time it opened easily, swinging wide as if the building had finished with me, spitting me back into the night. Outside, the slum was alive with light, every window glowing, every alley lit by that cold, impossible fire, and in the glare, I finally understood the truth that chilled me to my core. The place was not abandoned. It had never truly been abandoned. Its residents were still here, bound to these ruins, trapped in an existence between life and death, and now that I had crossed their threshold, they were not going to let me leave without carrying a piece of them with me. The instant I stepped back out into the alley, the slum erupted into a fever of light and sound, every window blazing with that unnatural glow, every ruined doorway pulsing as if the buildings themselves had veins and hearts, pumping cold fire through their bones. The air vibrated with a deafening hum that rattled in my teeth and burrowed into my skull, a chorus of countless voices rising together, no longer whispers but chants, layered and relentless, speaking words I couldn't understand yet, somehow felt as if the meaning was being etched into the marrow of my bones. "You are ours, you are ours, you are ours." I stumbled forward, disoriented, the ground tilting beneath my feet, and realized with horror that the alleys no longer led where they should. The paths twisted in impossible ways, looping back on themselves, doors opening into staircases that ended in walls, windows showing not empty rooms, but other alleys stretching away, infinite and wrong, as though the slum had come alive to trap me within its shifting maze. I screamed into the void, my voice ripped apart by the roar of the chant, and when I turned my light upward I saw them, all of them, crowding the windows, pressing against the glass, their faces pale and hollow, mouths stretched in silent screams, while their eyes burned with the same white fire that poured from every crevice of the ruins. They watched me with a hunger so sharp it felt physical, and I collapsed to my knees under the weight of their gaze, clutching my skull as if it might crack, open under the pressure. And then the lights moved, not just flickering inside the buildings, but sliding into the streets, into the alleys, drifting out of windows and doors like living flames. Dozens, then hundreds of them, floating in circles around me, weaving patterns in the air that pulsed in rhythm with the chanting. My flashlight flickered and died, swallowed by their brilliance, leaving me bathed in their glow, my shadow twisting and stretching across the cobblestones as though it no longer belonged to me. The flames swirled tighter, pressing closer until I felt heat prickling my skin. though the air remained cold as a tomb. And in the center of the storm, figures began to emerge, no longer indistinct shadows but fully formed shapes of men, women, and children, their bodies translucent yet terrifyingly solid, their faces locked in grotesque expressions of suffering and rage, as if their last moments of life had been burned into their souls forever. They stepped toward me in unison, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if their bones were grinding against each other with every step. And though their mouths opened wide, the sound that came out was not a scream, but the deafening roar of the chant, pouring from their throats like a single monstrous voice. I staggered back, but the alley behind me had vanished, replaced by a wall of black stone that hadn't been there before, slick with moisture and warm to the touch when I pressed my trembling hand against it, as if the slum itself had sealed off every escape, forcing me deeper into its nightmare. The figures surrounded me, their eyes blazing, their mouths gaping wider and wider until their jaws cracked open far beyond human limits, and from their throats poured streams of light that twisted together above me, forming a spiral in the sky that stretched higher and higher until it seemed to pierce the clouds. The spiral spun faster, pulling the air from my lungs, dragging me upward. And in that blinding cyclone of fire and shadow, I finally understood. They weren't just haunting this place. They were this place, bound forever to its bones, and they wanted me to join them, to become another voice in their endless chant. I screamed, fighting against the pull, my body shaking violently as the ground cracked beneath me, cobblestones splitting open to reveal darkness deeper than any shadow. And from that abyss rose hands, skeletal, charred, covered in ash, reaching for my ankles, my legs, clawing their way up my body with desperate hunger. I thrashed, trying to kick free, but the grip was unrelenting, cold as iron and hot as fire all at once, burning into my skin as they dragged me downward. The chanting grew louder, the spiral spun faster, and above me the faces in the windows leaned closer, pressing against the glass until it shattered, yet no shards fell, only more light, more fire, pouring down like rain. I was drowning in it, my vision consumed by white brilliance and black shadows twisting together, and in the midst of it, all one figure stepped forward, clearer than the rest. A woman, her hair long and tangled, her eyes blazing brighter than any of the others, her face twisted with grief and fury. She raised her arm and pointed directly at me, and though her mouth never moved, I heard her voice inside my head, as clear as my own thoughts. "You opened the door. You belong to us now." The words slammed into me with the weight of a sentence, final and inescapable, and in that instant the hands yanked harder, pulling me toward the abyss. I clawed at the stones, tearing my fingers bloody, my screams lost in the storm. And for a moment I felt myself slipping, falling, about to vanish into the endless dark, where their chant would consume me forever. The hands were pulling me down, dragging me toward the gaping cracks that split open beneath the cobblestones. And for a moment I truly believed that was how it would end, that I would be swallowed alive into the abyss of that cursed favela, my voice joining the endless chant of those who had come before me. But some stubborn instinct for survival exploded inside my chest, and with a roar that tore my throat raw, I lashed out, slamming the rusted key I still clutched in my hand against the clawed fingers wrapped around my legs. The metal burned with sudden heat as it struck, flaring with the same eerie blue fire that had poured from the windows, and the skeletal hands recoiled with a shriek that split the night, giving me just enough space to wrench myself free and collapse onto the stones, gasping, my vision swimming with tears and light. I scrambled to my feet, slipping on the cracked ground as the spiral of fire above me began to collapse inward, the figures in the windows leaning so. Far forward, I thought they would pour into the streets, their faces twisting into furious masks of rage, their chant breaking apart into an unbearable cacophony of screams. I ran, half blind, stumbling through alleys that seemed to shift and fold around me, Doors opening into walls, staircases leading down only to twist upward again, the entire slum reshaping itself into a labyrinth intent on keeping me trapped. And every corner I turned was filled with more light, more figures, their eyes following me, their whispers stabbing into my skull like needles. Stay, stay, stay. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to move, had to keep running. Because if I stopped even for a heartbeat, I knew they would close around me again. The key burned in my palm, guiding me somehow, tugging me toward passages I wouldn't have chosen on my own, steering me through the impossible maze, though whether it led me to salvation or deeper into their snare, I couldn't tell. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror carried me forward over crumbling staircases, through doorways swallowed by vines, past houses where shadows flickered and vanished before my eyes, and always the chant pursued me, echoing in the walls, the ground, even the sky above, until I no longer knew if it came from them or from inside my own head. Then as I burst into another open square, I froze. The way ahead was blocked by dozens of them, figures rising from the ground itself, their translucent bodies glowing, their eyes locked on me with predatory hunger. I staggered backward, heart hammering, but the path behind had already closed, bricks and rubble sealing the alley in silence. Trapped. My chest tightened as the figures began to advance, their movements slow but certain, their mouths opening to pour out that endless roar. And for a moment, my knees buckled, despair flooding through me, until I remembered the message tied to the key: do not look back. I clenched my teeth, gripping the key so tightly its edges cut into my skin, and forced myself forward, straight into the advancing horde. Every instinct screamed at me to turn, to run, but I kept my eyes locked ahead, pushing through the suffocating press of bodies that weren't fully solid, that flickered like flames and yet felt cold and heavy as smoke. They brushed against me, clawed at me, whispered into my ears, but I kept moving step by step until at last I broke through, collapsing on the other side into another alley that sloped downward, away from the heart of the hill. I scrambled to my feet and ran again, my boots pounding against the stones, the air tearing at my throat, until I saw it. The faint glow of the city below, the living Rio de Janeiro stretching out in the distance, a reminder that the world still existed outside this nightmare. I threw myself down the slope, every step a battle against the pull of the slum, which seemed to twist behind me, alleys folding and collapsing as if the whole place were trying to drag me back. The chants rose higher, angrier, their voices blending into a storm that rattled the ground. And though I wanted to turn and see what chased me, the warning blazed in my mind: do not look back. So I didn't. I kept my eyes fixed on the faint lights of the city, even as the glow of the favela seared against my back, brighter and brighter, until I felt like the sun itself was rising behind me. Tears streamed from my eyes as the heat clawed at my skin, but I forced myself onward, stumbling, crawling when my legs gave out, dragging myself through weeds and broken glass, until at last the ground evened out and I collapsed onto the cracked asphalt of the road that circled the base of the hill. The moment I crossed that invisible line, everything stopped, the chanting, the light, the heat. All of it cut off in an instant, leaving only silence and the distant hum of traffic from the city below. I lay there on the asphalt, chest heaving, blood dripping from my palms where the key's teeth had cut deep, staring up at the starless sky in disbelief that I had actually made it out alive. For a long time, I couldn't move, too afraid that if I lifted my head, the lights would still be there, waiting for me at the top of the hill. And when I finally did look, when I dared to raise my eyes toward the ruins above, the favela was dark, silent, nothing more than a tangle of shadows and vines, as if nothing had ever happened, as if it had all been a fevered dream. But I knew better. I could still feel the echo of their chant in my bones, still see the spiral of light burning in the back of my mind, and when I opened my palm, the rusted key was still there, slick with my blood, proof that I hadn't escaped empty-handed, and proof that they had let me go, not because I had won, but because they wanted me to carry their secret back into the world of the living. For days after I escaped that hill, I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't even step into a darkened room without feeling the weight of unseen eyes pressing against me. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw that spiral of light spinning above me, dragging me downward into the abyss. I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination, the product of exhaustion and too many stories told in hushed voices at bars. But the rusted key never left my pocket, heavier than it should have been, warmer than any metal should be, as if it carried within it the heartbeat of that place. Sometimes, in the silence of my apartment, I swore I heard faint knocking against the walls, 3 hollow raps echoing just as they had in the alleys of the favela. And once, as I lay awake at 3 in the morning, I saw a pale glow seep from under my bedroom door, flickering like the lights that had danced between the ruins, though when I opened it the hallway was empty, cold and silent. I thought I'd left it behind, but the truth is you don't leave a place like that. You carry it with you, stitched into your shadow, etched into your blood, a tether that can be pulled at any moment. I stopped asking questions, stopped telling people where I had gone, because I quickly realized that whenever I spoke of it, the lights returned, reflections in glass that shouldn't have been there, shadows leaning too close behind me, whispers curling from corners of the room. The key sits now in the drawer by my bed, wrapped in layers of cloth, yet even through that, I feel its pulse, faint but steady, like a reminder, like a promise. And sometimes, late at night, when the city outside is quiet and only the hum of distant traffic fills the air, I hear it again. The chant, soft at first, then swelling, hundreds of voices weaving together, until I can no longer tell whether it's echoing from the hills of Rio or from inside my own skull. I don't dare return to that place, but I know the lights still move there, sliding through the ruins, marking the alleys, watching, waiting, and maybe calling to anyone foolish enough to follow them. If you ever find yourself in Rio de Janeiro and someone warns you about a favela abandoned decades ago, a place where no one dares to climb after dark, listen to them. Don't do what I did. Don't let curiosity drag you into a maze that was never meant to release you. Because I escaped once, yes, but sometimes I wonder if I truly did, or if I've simply been allowed to wander free until the day they decide it's time to pull me back. And when that day comes, when the lights finally appear outside my window instead of up on that cursed hill, I know I won't be able to resist looking just once over my shoulder. And when I do, I will belong to them forever.